here are my objectives. Number one, I want to describe the BOLD program school's strategic context. What were the pressures and environmental context of these schools that shaped to some extent how they might have reacted to blended learning? I'm going to do that disguising the names of the schools. So that's a little tricky for me because I might blurt out the name of the school. But we're trying to preserve confidentiality while giving you a sense of, what was their context. I'm sure if somebody is dying to, communicate to a particular school, perhaps Rachel, I don't want to volunteer you too much, but maybe you could make some connections. If somebody says, that's our strategic context, we really want to learn more about what happened there, maybe, through Rachel's good graces, you can kind of make that connection. Assess the financial success of the program and what this suggests for likely future iterations of the program. We don't know if there are going to be other BOLD iterations. Certainly that's in the purview of the funders. But I will talk a little bit about if we were to do this again, from the lenses of what we learned from the participating schools, what might make it more successful? What were some of the things that impeded success, supported success, and what are the lessons learned so that other schools or funders who might want to embark on more of the same have some context for this. So again, classic question, was this a success or failure? Objectively, if the goal was for the schools to save a lot of money, it was not a success, right? I'll talk about one school that had other strategic reasons for wanting to save money, and in the process implemented blended learning. But in general, it was not a success. However, from my perspective, a tremendous amount was learned, and a number of the schools, from the lenses of the school leadership, regarded as successful, and even on a potential pathway to financial success. So I'll talk a little bit about that. Okay, first the strategic context of the schools, right? So in terms of denomination and grades, we had one pluralistic school, TK to 12th grade, a modern Orthodox. The other four schools were all modern Orthodox schools. Early childhood to 8th grade school, K to 12, a modern Orthodox school where a high school division implemented blended learning, and a modern Orthodox school with an early child to 8th grade. Now, where did they implement blended learning? In the first case, the pluralistic school, it was focused on elementary. The second school, elementary. The third school, middle and elementary, with somewhat different success. This was a high school, obviously, and here the 8th grade. So we had a different set of grades that were being impacted by blended learning. What was the competitive context of this? It turns out that competition can either be an enabler of wanting to do something like blended learning to differentiate yourselves, but it can also be a disabler if it makes you concerned about losing students if you're not successful. So I just want to paint the picture a little bit. We have three schools of the 5 were in intense competitive environments. Lots of schools chasing, similar students, right? So they had to worry about competition. The first school was actually competing against independent schools primarily, right? That was their target market were people who might pick an independent school or a Jewish day school. The second was an intense Jewish day school competitive environment. Somewhat similar schools, with niches, but competing for the same students. Not a lot of room for stumbling or not having happy families, and we'll see the consequences of that later. The third school, also in a competitive environment, but very strongly positioned. They were already what I'll call a low-cost school, and had already done a lot of efficiency building, right? And we're really in a very good position, and we're looking at blended learning as a way to build on strength. They were not in any jeopardy, per se. Other two schools, low intense competition, looking at blended learning as a way to enhance their condition, right? So this is an important context as we see what actually happened. School A, in an intense environment, was in a deficit condition. They were losing money. So saving money would have been really important to them. They had an unclear value proposition, meaning they didn't have a strong competitive positioning. So blended learning was viewed by them as a way to differentiate themselves in the marketplace. And they needed to reinvent themselves because they were in deficit, losing market share, and looking for an identity. Second school, slowly declining in enrollment, looking at blended learning as a way to perhaps, again, differentiate themselves. The other schools were stable and basically looking at blended learning as an add-on. Not a must-have, but more of an optional, here's something I'm going to experiment with. What difference do you think this might make, the competitive context and their strategic conditioning? How might that affect how they embraced blended learning?
The level of buying, self-buying, whether they're willing to recognize that it's not going so well.
Okay, so maybe the intensity of their commitment when things got tough. Marlon?
Risk-reward analysis. The risk-reward analysis.
Right, so it might impact what?
How vulnerable they feel to make dramatic
Right.
changes.
That's very true. This school, School E, we're not going to talk much more about. You know why? Because, again, they were in a very good strategic condition in a competitive market, already low cost. Blended learning was sort of, can we do better? They ended up dropping out of the program after 2 years because they didn't see the return on investment. In other words, because they were already stable and successful and low cost, they looked at, okay, here's what we have to invest to do blended learning, here's what we're going to get out of it, not a good calculus, you know, we're on to something else respectfully, okay? So we're going to talk mostly about the other 4 schools. There's also a leadership issue, and this turns out to be very important in some cases. We had 2 new heads of school in the first 2 schools. Intense competitive environment, looking for improvement. One had a whole new administrative team with a change agenda, and another had a new head of school also with somewhat of a change agenda. School 3, which ended up not being really successful in the eyes of the administration, had severe turnover during the program, right? The head of school departed, then the academic leader in charge of blended learning departed suddenly for personal reasons. This severely, obviously, impacted the results and their ability to be successful, okay? So we had in the other 4 cases, we basically had stable leadership. In 2 cases, new heads of school coming in. Now, there's a lot of debate about success. When I talk success, it's not Harry Bloom talking success. I can't speak with the authority of Tricia. This is the lens of the school leadership, right? What they, in my interviews and discussions with them, basically said they viewed successful, unsuccessful, okay? First school, intense deficits, needed a turnaround, right? They would call, and I'm going to talk more about them, successful, played a key role in the turnaround, and I'll describe that more specifically. Although objectively, we may not have seen the test scores, they would say that strategically, this was a good match for them. Second school, successful. Not economically, need a longer track record of showing the benefits, but academically stable and building in strength. We're going to keep blended learning as a modality. The next 2 schools, basically, from the standpoint of the leadership, not successful educationally and unsure about future commitment to blended learning, right? And again, these were 2 schools where this was not a must-have strategically. They were in stable conditions. It was more of an optional improvement. They are uncertain about their commitment to blended learning. I want to talk about the financial outcomes, right? Only 1 school, School A, achieved significant cost reduction through staffing reductions during the course of the program. Now you might say, well, wait a second, we just heard from Tricia that nobody did. This school basically embarked, because they were in deficit, on a severe reduction in staffing, independent of blended learning. because they had to. They had to reduce staff to right the ship. The head of school basically said we were overstaffed. They put in reasonable staffing loads, and they basically had to cut staff. However, what they will also tell you, and you'll see in a minute, is that by implementing blended learning in the context of a staff reduction, they actually maintained and even improved educational quality. So that was the role of blended learning. So if you want to know if blended learning is consistent with lower, a higher student to faculty ratio, School A actually achieved that, but not using blended learning as the chief modality to get there, but using it as a way to be leaner while still individualizing learning. School B achieved sufficient educational stability to consider implementing staff reductions, but because they were in a severe competitive context, they didn't pull the trigger. They basically said, we need more evidence, right, before we tell our parents that we're going to be cutting out a section and increasing class size, but we're committed to this for the long term. Again, the other two schools, not so sure about committed to the long term. And again, needed it less. I want to talk about School A. Here's the evidence. School A decreased faculty FTEs significantly. These are teacher FTEs in the elementary school, and these are associate teacher FTEs. Very severe reductions, right? Student to faculty ratio as a result climbed, right? From 5 slowly to 7.6. When you ask parents, and Tricia reported on this, to what extent do you agree with the following? I'm glad my school has implemented blended learning. Strongly agree 51%, agree 35%. I'm not going to go through too much. Same positive, 79% said I believe blended learning has enhanced my child's engagement in school. So basically, from a parent standpoint, they were successful. Again, even in the context of these severe shifts in faculty to student ratios. Head of school perspective, quotes, we right-sized teachers and teaching assistants. That is when BOLD appeared, and it was a godsend because academically, from a pedagogy standpoint, it was terrific, and that is why we are continuing to use it today, and will continue to use it into the future. We could have achieved the cost savings without blended learning, but blended learning allowed us to reduce staff without having a negative academic impact, and in fact, allowed us to enhance the academic program. So there's something here to build on in terms of learning from School A. I want to quickly talk about School B. I'm sure I'm running too long, I'm sorry. Barriers, so this is the perspective of School B, which was somewhat representative about for all the schools. What impeded success with this program academically? Non-existence of a well-documented suite of software programs. There is no library that sort of analyzed and codified. So each school had to go off on its own and experiment with program. That's nobody's fault, but that's just the state of the industry. That cost a lot of time and momentum and built frustration, as was mentioned. The largely disproved expectation that in a very short amount of time, you can simultaneously implement a new educational model and save money. It just cannot be done. You have to give a runway, as Tricia said, to stabilize the educational system and then look at ways to refine it through the implementation of changes in section size, etc. The consulting support that was provided was not hands-on enough in the views of the school. They wanted more hand-holding at the local level in the classroom, and there simply wasn't enough support to do that. So lesson learned. Lack of strategic guidance about pace, again, as opposed to the counsel of start small and then build, start with one grade, establish a success model, move those faculty perhaps over as mentors, grade by grade, etc. Some schools were too ambitious, right? They embarked on a number of grades at a time, or simultaneously middle school, we'll implement middle school, and the next year start the lower school without stabilizing in the middle school. So this is a lesson learned. Two more. Lack of a compelling parent narrative. What the school leaders are asking for is, give me documentation that somewhere somebody has done this. I think school A is an interesting case study. I think school B could be an interesting case study. But the point is, in competitive school environments, school leaders